Hello and welcome. We are on the final part of Why We Fight. War Comes to America. Right off the bat, we want to say thank you all for being here. There's also a big change that you may not have noticed when you jumped on to see us. We've switched our name over. We're on YouTube, Mission 4938 Official, Twitch Mission 4938, TikTok Mission 4938, Facebook Mission 4938. We're all getting it all lined up there so you can find us easier and see what we have going on. So what we're going to do, we're going to hit this short content notice first. The following program contains authentic, unedited footage from the World War II era. The material may include racial stereotypes, offensive depictions, and symbols of hate, including Nazi imagery, as well as wartime propaganda that reflect the attitudes and realities of the time. The films are presented as originally produced, without alteration or censorship, for the purpose of historical record, education, and discussion. Mission 4938 does not endorse the views, language, and depictions shown. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. So, what we're looking at here is, how's it going? I see Historical Possum. I see Recon Sarge. How you guys doing? We're going to jump into some slideshows, kind of go over it. So we're going to learn a lot about Lend-Lease today. So if you're not very familiar with Lend-Lease was the ability for us to send weapons, to send planes and ships and all kinds of tools used in war to our, well, they're not our allies at the time because we weren't in the war, but to the people fighting the Axis powers. It was really, really big. It's what kept Russia in the fight. It's what kept China in the fight and kept Britain in the fight, really. So why this is such a big deal, why this was such a huge thing, was previous to this, America was a neutral, and we were aggressively neutral. So we're going to go over here. A neutrality. I can't see a thing, mates. We must be perfectly safe. And it's showing the war in Europe, the giant cloud of Nazism crowding over the top of Europe. But while that was going on, all those that were neutral were trying to bury their head in the sand and say that's a European war, when it had already kind of become such a bigger thing than a European war. It was in Africa, it was in Asia, it was pushing into Australia. It was definitely something way more than a just a little war. U.S. Neutrality Proclamation. This is the very first time we did a neutrality proclamation. It was Woodrow Wilson going through and trying to keep the U.S. out of foreign entanglements. And that was a big thing. That was something that was being pushed for by the American people because of how many people died in World War One. And this is the big thing. No foreign entanglements. That's what they kept pushing for. So in 1935, we signed a Neutrality Act that banned arms sales to countries at war. In 1936, continued the arms ban and prohibited loans to warring nations. In 37, we escalated and said expanded the rules and introduced cash and carry. Countries could buy non-military goods if they paid in cash and transported them themselves. And in 1939, we revised it and lifted the arms embargo and allowed weapons sales under cash and carry. And then from there, we expanded even further to Lend-Lease. And in doing so, it allowed these nations to get products and things. And then we began embargoes. So Japan was getting embargoed by us, oil, fuel, things like that. We're going to learn hey, how's it going, Sailor Sasquatch? So we're going to learn a lot about some of that stuff coming up. Again, this is the big finale of Why We Fight, and we're going to dive into how we got in the war, how the war was being perceived, and kind of America's neutrality and how that finally broke. So without further ado, we will jump into Why We Fight, the final chapter, War Comes to America. For those of you that served, what would you think of when they went through and made these kind of films during the period of service that you were in? Like if the U.S. Army Signal Corps continued to make those propaganda films today, what would you think that would be seen in those Signal Corps films? And do you think that have the same effect as something like this? We'll pause right there for any of you that are not history buffs. What was left out from that Pledge of Allegiance that you may have normally heard today, if you had heard it? I don't know how many people know that there was a change to the Pledge of Allegiance around this time. Uh, so the change to this was under God. Um, so they actually added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance later on. It was not there originally.
In the jungles of New Guinea, on the barren shores of the Aleutians, in the tropic heat of the Pacific Islands, in the sub-zero cold of the skies over Germany, in Burma and Iceland, the Philippines and Iran, France, in China and Italy, Americans fighting.
I'm going to stop. This has nothing to do with the history of it, but that for a little bit felt like a Huey Lewis and the News song. Was the Heart of Rock and Roll, where they just start listing off places randomly. That went on for way too long of just naming random countries.
Fighting over an area extending 7/8 of the way around the world. Men from the green hills of New England, the sun-baked plains of the Middle West, the cotton fields of the South, the close-packed streets of teeming factories of Detroit, Los Angeles, the endless stretching distances of the Southwest, men hills and from the plains, from the villages and from the cities, bookkeepers, soda jerks, mechanics, college students, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief, mountain fighting men. Yet 2 years ago, many had never fired a gun or seen the ocean or been off the ground. Americans, fighting for their country while half a world away from it, fighting for their country and for more than their country, fighting for an idea. The idea bigger than the country. Without the idea, the country might have remained only a wilderness. Without the country, the idea might have remained only a dream. Over this ocean, 1607, Jamestown. 1620, Plymouth Rock. Here was America, the sea, the sky, the virgin continent. We came in search of freedom, facing unknown dangers rather than bend the knee or bow to tyranny. Out of the native oak and pine, we built a house, a church, a watchtower. We cleared a field, and there grew up a colony of free citizens. We carved new states out of the green wilderness: Virginia, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Carolina. Then came the first test in the defense of that liberty. 1775, Lexington. Our leaders spoke our deepest needs. Colonists are by the law of nature free-born, as indeed all men are. It is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government. These are the times that try men's souls. But as for me, Give me liberty, or give me death. In the midst of battle, it happened. The idea grew. The idea took form. Something new was expressed by men, a new and revolutionary doctrine, the greatest creative force in human relations. All men are created equal. All men are entitled to the blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the goal we set for ourselves. Defeat meant hanging. Victory meant a world in which Americans rule themselves. 1777, Valley Forge. We fought and froze, suffered and died. For what? For the future freedom of all Americans. A few of us doubted and despaired. Most of us prayed and endured all. 1781. Now we were a free, independent nation. The new idea had won its first test. Now to pass it on to future Americans. The Constitution, the sacred charter of we the people. The blood and sweat of we the people. The life, liberty, and happiness of we the people. The people were to rule, not some of the people, not the best people or the worst, not the rich people or the poor, but people, all the people. In this brotherhood, America was born. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We began as 13 states along the Atlantic seaboard. We pushed across the Alleghenies, the Ohio River, the Mississippi, the last far range of the distant Rockies. We carried freedom with us. No aristocratic classes here, no kings, no nobles or princes, no state church, no courts, no parasites, no divine right of man to rule man. Here, humanity was making a clean, fresh start from scratch. Behind us, we left new states, chips off the old blocks welded together by freedom. Until finally we were one nation, a land of hope and opportunity that had arisen out of a skeptical world. A light was shining, freedom's light. From every country and every clime, men saw that light and turned their faces toward it. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift.
So we're going to stop real quick. We had a couple things we want to cover in that. One, that actually wasn't just a map of the continental United States. That was a map of all the states at the time. So you got to think, this came out in 45 and was shown to service members. It wasn't shown to the general public yet. And Alaska and Hawaii didn't become states until 1959. So it wasn't like they just left out Alaska and Hawaii. One of the other things we want to cover is we've not talked a whole lot about him up until now, but the person in charge of these films was in the Army. He was in the Signal Corps. He volunteered to join into the Signal Corps. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with his other works, but this is the director of It Happened One Night from 1934. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939. And maybe his most famous work still today, It's a Wonderful Life. Frank Capra was just an amazing, or Capra, make sure you pronounce the R in there, was an amazing director. He's won 5 Academy Awards, but he was who they put in charge of teaching service members, why are we fighting? Why are we going into these conflicts? Because that's what all of these were made for. He was Italian born. He was born in Sicily and then immigrated into the United States. And so his whole patriotism and everything they saw is not because he was or not because he was an American born and raised. He came to America. He chose to, or his family came to America and to start a better life. And so he believed a lot of what he was saying in this. He absolutely went on to make some amazing movies. Directed a lot of great things, but he really wanted this assignment because one of the things he thought was if we teach service members why we're in this fight and what we're fighting for, they will fight harder and they will want to fight the fight. And I think he was right. If you look back at the whole series and you were watching those as somebody who was just recently drafted or just some recently joined, seeing why we're fighting and understanding why we're fighting would have made it incredibly easier to say, yes, I'm on board with fighting this fight. And so that's kind of what we're looking here. We're looking at an absolute genius when it comes to storytelling with Frank Capra, doing something innovative that had never been done before, stitching together pieces of war conflict, stitching together individual scenes from battles and putting them together in a way that told the whole story. Just his genius shines throughout this whole work. So as we're watching this, this is the guy who did give us It's a Wonderful Life and all those other great films. So it's kind of a cool thing on that. And we'll have some more about him a little bit later.
My lamp beside the golden door. As strangers to one another, we came and built a country, and the country built us into Americans. The man of old nations was poured out to build the new. The sweat of our first settlers, the English, the Scotch, the Dutch, building the workshop of New England, of the Italian in the sulfur mines of Louisiana, of the Frenchman and the Swiss in the vineyards of California and New York State, of the Dane, the Norwegian, the Swede, seeding the good earth to make the Midwest bloom with grain, of the Pole and the Welshman, of the Negro harvesting cotton in the hot southern sun, of the Spaniard, the first to roam the great Southwest, of the Mexican in the oil fields of Texas and on the ranches of New Mexico, of the Greek and the Portuguese harvesting the crop the oceans yield, of the German with his technical skill, of the Hungarian and the Russian, of the Irish, Slav, and the Chinese working side by side. The sweat of Americans, and a great nation was built.
We'll kind of cut in while this montage is going on. So one of the other things that we're looking at here, oh, now they're going to talk.
And the blood. For the blood of Americans has been freely shed. 5 times in our history have we withstood the challenge to the idea that made our nation. The idea of equality for all men. Life, liberty, and the pursuit made us the people we are. Let's take a look at ourselves before we went into this war.
Well, first of all, we're a working people. On the land, at the workbench, at a desk. And we're an inventive people. The lightning rod, cotton gin, the telegraph, the blessed anesthesia of ether, the rotary printing press, the telephone, electric welding, the incandescent lamp, the submarine, the steam turbine, the motor-driven airplane, the X-ray tube, the gyroscope compass, the sewing machine, television. All these and countless more bear witness to our inventiveness. And this inventiveness and enterprise, plus our hard-won democratic ideal of the greatest good for the greatest number, created for the average man the highest standard of living in the world. 32.5 million registered automobiles, 2/3 of all the automobiles there are in the entire world. We demand the highest standards in sanitation, purity of food, medical care. Our hospitals are models for the world to copy. We want the best for the average man, woman, or child, particularly child. We have reduced the hazard of being born. From then on, we protect, foster, and generally spoil the majority of our children. But it doesn't seem to hurt them much. They go to school, all kinds of schools, to kindergarten, public schools, private schools, trade schools, high schools, to 25,000 high schools, and to college. In the last war, 20% of all the men in the armed forces had been to high school or college. In this war, 63%. We're a great 2 weeks vacation people. We hunt, and we fish. Up north, down south, back east, out west. When the season opens, we hunt and fish. And we're a sports-loving people.
One, I want to point out how the wild fact of calling marbles and frog racing sports is kind of wild to me. But if you pay attention to those numbers, what they say, there's 2,500 high schools at that time, which is really insane compared to the number of high schools there are today. There was also, they're saying 63% of people either went to high school or college. They also aren't meaning graduating, because there still wasn't a huge graduation rate for high school, but there was a lot more people going at least until high school when the war started, which is also kind of crazy because the Depression was on. But one of the ways they affected in the Depression that did cause more people to go to school was they were attempting to pass more child labor laws, which created reasons for people to hire adults more than hiring children, things like that. So that has some of effect on this. And we're going to take a short pause from the video to talk about something else, because one of the things that we're doing with this channel is building community. And part of the reason we chose Frank Capra's style of Why We Fight, and his version of Why We Fight, is because of another thing with Frank Capra. So Jimmy Stewart, who was on his next film, It's a Wonderful Life, his next big film, came back. He was a B-24 bomber. He had actually risen through the rank of colonel. He flew a bunch of flight missions. And if you don't know, Jimmy Stewart was actually struggling really, really badly with PTSD. He had worked with Frank Capra before on Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And when they got back, Jimmy Stewart didn't know if he wanted to go back into acting. He didn't know if he wanted to be involved in society anymore. His PTSD had been an absolute crippling thing for him. Frog racing needs to make a comeback. Frank Capra, though he did not serve in a combat capacity, could see and recognize what was happening with Jimmy Stewart. And as a director, he was saying, hey, channel what you're feeling. He understood those feelings. He understood to give Jimmy Stewart breaks on set. He understood, hey, look, I'm not going to push you harder than I have to on this role. I really want you to be this role and you to portray it because your feelings and our emotions are there. But it was also someone, it was a veteran helping another veteran. Hey, I see the challenge you're going through. Let me help be a lifeline for you to get you through and get you back reintegrated into the world. And that is a very powerful thing, and that's part of why we do the whole streaming thing. That's why we do the games with Recon. That's the reason we do my watch alongs. It's about building that community, not just for veterans to be there and say, hey, we're here for each other, but also for their families and for all of those that support to come in and be involved in that. And that's a key critical part of why we're doing this, and it's part of why we chose Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, because there's a certain amount of respect for watching someone who is a famous director who didn't need to take extra time and cast Jimmy Stewart and spend that extra time of working with another veteran who was really struggling, but chose to do that anyway deliberately because he wanted to be there for a fellow veteran. And that's what this is all about. And so that's part of the reason we picked this series. And it's something that I kind of have not delved into a whole lot until now, because we're at the part where it's kind of the positive thing. America's going to get involved and the war is going to start changing pace. But that's why we wanted to bring that up now is Frank Capra, what he did, completely admire that. He continued to work with other war veterans through the time. That was something that he really enjoyed doing. You didn't see Frank Capra partying and hanging around with people like John Wayne, who use their fame to keep themselves from going to war. You saw him purposely going after spending time with those that that were there.
And we're probably the travelingest nation in all history. We love to go places. We have the cars, we have the roads, we have the scenery. We don't need passports, but sometimes we need alibis. We sleep by the road, we eat by the road. The foreigner is enchanted and amazed by what we like to put on our stomachs. And we're a great joining people. We join clubs, fraternities, unions, federations. Shove a blanket us, we'll sign up. Radios, we have one in the living room,
When you think of refreshment, think of
the dining room, the bedroom, the bathroom, in our cars,
and in case of acid indigestion,
in our hands, and up our sleeves.
does your cigarette taste different lately?
Music, we couldn't be without it. The press, yes, it's the biggest, but most important, it's the freest on earth. Over 12,000 newspapers of all shades of opinion, books on every conceivable subject, and more than 6,000 different magazines, not counting the comics. Churches, we have every denomination on earth. 60 million of us regularly attend, and no one dares tell us which one to go to. We elect our own neighbors to govern us. We believe in individual enterprise and opportunity for men and women alike. We make mistakes. We see the results. We correct the mistakes. We skyrocket into false prosperities and then plummet down into false, needless depressions. But in spite of everything, we never lose our faith in the future. We believe in the future. We build for the future.
Yes, we build for the future. And the future always catches up with us. Before we're done building, we've developed something new and have to start rebuilding. That's roughly the kind of people we are. Boastful, easygoing, sentimental, but underneath passionately dedicated to the ideal our forefathers passed on to us, the liberty and dignity of man. We've made great material progress, but spiritually we're still in the frontier days. Yet deep down within us, there is a great yearning for peace and goodwill toward men. Somehow we feel that if men turn their minds toward the fields of peace, as they have toward the fields of transportation, communication, or aviation, wars would soon be as old-fashioned as the horse and buggy days. We hate war. We know that in war, it's the common man who does the pain, the suffering, the dying. We bend over backwards to avoid it. But let our freedoms be endangered, and we'll pay and suffer and fight to the last man. That is the America. That is the way of living for which we fight today. Why? Is that fight necessary? Did we want war? In 1917, before most of you fighting men were born, our fathers fought the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, for the common man. They fought a good fight. There was to be no more war in their time or their children's time. Faithful to our treaty obligations, we destroyed much of our naval tonnage. Our army.
So we're going to bring that up. So after World War I, we did destroy a bunch of our military equipment because you got to think the League of Nations was kind of riding high. They just passed a resolution that no country shall enter into conflict to resolve international disputes. But that was already quickly falling apart. We had minor wars and scrimmages. We had things like that. We had a huge military that we shrunk down afterwards. And it was the thought of, well, yeah, we're never going to engage in another conflict again. Also, when these soldiers came back home, they were coming home to Spanish flu. They were coming home to several other things where a lot of people had died. And so the American people quickly got this idea of, we don't want to entangle ourselves over there anymore. We're safe in the United States. Look, we've got an ocean to one side. We have an ocean to another. We have mountains. We have the ability to kind of protect ourselves and isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. Why do we need to have this huge cost of life when America can stay here and stay hidden and not have to engage in these conflicts that have cost us so much? And so people celebrated and cheered as the military ships were being destroyed, as we were selling off planes. Again, we had the biplanes and stuff from World War I. They were selling them off to farmers to be used as crop dusters, and they were just getting rid of everything because the thought was, America will never fight another war again. Our citizens and our people are safe. And so that was kind of the attitude, and that's what you're going to start seeing that motivation come through. We should not have the cost of life that we had seen in World War I. We're safe here in America.
They went on a reducing diet until it became little more than a skeleton. For us, war was to be outlawed. For us, Europe was far away. And as for Asia, well, that was really out of this world, where everything looked like it was torn from the National Geographic. Yet, in this remote spot in Asia, in 1931, while most of you were playing ball in the sandlots, this war started. Without warning, Japan invaded Manchuria. Once again, men who were peaceful became the slaves of men who were violent. In Washington, D.C., our Secretary of State made a most vigorous protest. The American government does not intend to recognize any situation, treaty, or agreement which may be brought about by means of aggression. But we, the people, hadn't much time to think about Manchuria.
Okay, so we're going to pause here because they glossed over that really quickly. Stimson was a huge proponent of not necessarily engaging in action against Japan, but he sat there and made the comment, we could steam our ships over to Japan. A show of force is all it would take to stop them from invading Manchuria. Let's cut off their oil and let's send our ships towards their country and see if we can force them. And what was found out later was Stimson was right. Japan had started the invasion of Manchuria, but they were very, very cautious about it. And kind of a message that had been sent around is, if America sends their ships our way, because they were watching Stimson and what he was saying, we have to withdraw. We will not be able to fight this war. So Stimson kind of was pushing everyone that he could. Herbert Hoover, he was pushing FDR, he was pushing anybody he could push, saying we have to send our ships. We can't let this start, because if we let this start, war is going to rage again. And he was completely ignored.
We were wrestling with the worst depression in our history. Some of us were out of jobs. Some of us stood in bread lines. Some of us suffered homemade aggression. Some of us were choked with dust. Some of us had no place to go. 2 years later, in 1933, while most of you were graduating from high school, we read that a funny little man called Hitler had come into power in Germany. We heard that a thing called the Nazi Party had taken over. Today we rule Germany, tomorrow the world. What kind of talk was that? It must be only hot air. In 1935, about the time you had your first date, we read that strutting Mussolini had attacked far-off Ethiopia. The disease seemed to be spreading, so Congress assembled to insulate us against the growing friction of war.
We want no war. We'll have no war, save in defense of our own people or our own honor.
Toward this end, our chosen representatives passed the Neutrality Act.
So we're going to pause again. So not only did Italy invade Ethiopia, sorry if I can get my words out, Haile Selassie had spoken to the United States, look, I need help. I only had one plane. They're attacking, they're bombing, this aggression. We can't survive it forever. And then Shanghai Chek's wife came and spoke to Congress. And we were starting to break our neutrality at that point. But these leaders came to the United States. They went through European leaders and saying, look, war is going to happen and it's going to eventually come to your door. It's first going to be us and then it's going to be you. And they were laughed off in Europe. They were laughed off in the United States. And it's kind of that evil people prosper when good people do nothing. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. And there were forewarnings beforehand. And all of these were kind of we've talked about this before, they were dominoes placed in effect. Japan's invasion of Manchuria was a test to see if other countries would stand up and do anything. When no one did anything, Hitler was actually involved in pushing Mussolini. Yeah, go attack Ethiopia. And so when that happened, they watched. They didn't send their whole forces at first. Send a force. Is anyone going to stop us? And when no one stopped them, it caused the ripple effect. And so this is kind of one of those things. And that's part of the reason I always say that it seems like every 20 years we have another conflict, another war. And that is kind of the thing. A war can be so desperate and bad that nobody wants to see another one happen. But every 20 years, it does seem to spring back up. And so when we're looking at this, and right now, even today, people are like, why are we in Iran, or why are we in any other countries that we are in? One of the reasons why is because the World War I isolationism didn't do anything to protect us. It eventually caused us to be attacked on American soil. But also because sometimes a small little kernel of a fight can blossom into something much, much bigger. And so the question becomes, do we get involved in the fight and try to stop it before that kernel spreads? And sometimes that can be the right answer. But other times, that small kernel can turn into something much bigger. Had we followed Simpson's logic, no American lives would have potentially been lost, and there might not have been a World War II, or at least not a World War II at that point in time. Had we continued to listen to him and follow his urging about intervening, or getting France to intervene, because they own the Suez Canal, or the British intervene because they're the ones that had military control of the Suez Canal. Italy couldn't have even sent forces to Ethiopia. And so these little things, these history lessons, I know we're learning about the history and kind of going over it and kind of getting a veteran viewpoint on it, but these little things also have learning lessons for us all. If we sit there and we learn from these histories of, hey, how did we get to World War II to the point it was where it was? And people think of, oh, well, if we just stopped Hitler. And it's much easier than that. Had we just given a little bit of concern and a little bit of effort into stopping Japan from the invasion of Manchuria, none of the rest would have fallen. The dominoes would have stayed all upright.
No nation at war could buy manufactured arms or munitions from the United States. In 1936, when you were running around in jalopies, we were disturbed by news from Spain. In our newsreels, we saw German and Italian air forces and armies fighting in Spain and wondered what they were doing there. For the first time, we saw great cities squashed flat, civilians bombed and killed. In November 1936, the American Institute of Public Opinion, known as the Gallup Poll, asked a representative cross-section of American people, if another war develops in Europe, should America take part again? No. 95%. We the people had spoken. 19 out of 20 of us said, include us out. To further insulate ourselves, we added a cash and carry amendment to the Neutrality Act. Not only wouldn't we sell munitions, but we wouldn't sell anything at all, not even a spool of thread, unless warring powers sent their own ships and paid cash on the line. In 1937, the press services received a flash from Asia. Japs were turning Asia into a slaughterhouse. But for us, Asia was still far away. In September 1937, the Gallup poll asked us, in the present fight between Japan and China, are your sympathies with either side? We answered, with China, 43%. With Japan, 2%. Undecided, 55%. We hadn't made up our minds about China. Our Neutrality Act barred sales of armaments only to nations at war. The Japanese had not declared war, so we went right on selling scrap iron and aviation gasoline to Japan. In March 1938, Hitler had not declared war either, but his goose-stepping army suddenly smashed in and occupied all the soil of Austria. 6 months later, Hitler and his stooge met the anxious democracies at Munich. Hitler promised peace in our time if Britain and France would give him that part of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. Britain and France gave him that part of Czechoslovakia, hoping to avert war.
And again, this is that little kernel we're talking about. We don't want to go to conflict, and so we will give in and let people have what they want, or we won't get involved. And that little kernel keeps, it's like popcorn, it just starts popping and expanding and growing. And more as that heat starts building up, will start popping that same way. And so that's one of those things. If you can stop that early heat transmission, that early, hey, if we want this and we take it, nobody's going to do anything. If you can stop that initial chain reaction, then you can go through and slowly try to calm this down. But instead, we just kept giving in and allowing more and more and more with no stop in sight.
Now we had his word, peace in our time. At home, we began to hear strange hits.
And of course, nothing like having those films have to flip over and get the new film reel put in place there. Again, this is a recording right off the originals and the original showing of it. So what you're seeing there is them splicing the film together to get those pieces back and get the film up and going. You would see this a lot more. Oh, there we go. We're coming back up. But you'd see this in older films sometimes, and it's kind of that beauty of nostalgia is gone.
We read that the Tokyo Diet was appropriating tremendous sums, converting Japan into one vast munitions plant. We watched these supposedly poor have for armament, and we wondered why. Arrogantly, they told us why. They had declared war on us long before the shooting started.
We have actually been at war since the day when we lifted the flag of our revolution, the democratic world. Germans are noble and unique men, to whom the earth was given by the top star. The world must come to look upon our emperor as the great ruler of all nations.
When the people of these elected to follow their leaders, Death Incorporated, they organized to personal freedom, equality of man, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, organized to smash the very principles which made us the people we are. So in December 1938, when the poll asked us, should the United States increase the strength of its Army, Navy, and Air Force, we answered yes, 85%. It was time to look to our defense.
Gentlemen, the Military Affairs Committee of the United States House of Representatives for the purpose of considering national defense.
The Navy is asking for an increase of 25% in authorized naval tonnage in view of the grave international situation.
Congress, reflecting the voice of the people, appropriated the largest sum for military use ever voted during peace in American history. Seen that a few years later it would look like peanuts. 1939, Adolf Hitler broke. He took over all the rest of Czechoslovakia. There was more peace in our time. 1939, as we here in America observe.
Mussolini and paper extra for Italy attacks Albania.
The picture was becoming clear. The conquering force of violence were being set loose in the world. Where would they stop? In a last desperate effort to avert a world war, President Roosevelt, as a neutral, sent messages to Hitler and Mussolini, asking their promise to respect the independence of 30 free countries. To Adolf Hitler, this message was a huge joke as he repeated the names to a jeering Reichstag.
Sweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Arabien, Syrien, Palästina, Ägypten.
This was the only answer the president received. On September the 1st, 1939, the Nazi army smashed into Poland. England and France had a treaty with Poland. Would they act now? At home, we listened in suspense.
Adolf Hitler's all-out attack on Poland makes the long-dreaded European war a certainty. Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain gave the Nazi dictator a 0 hour for withdrawing his troops from Poland. That 0 hour ends now. At this time, we transfer you to London for an important announcement by the British Prime Minister.
Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland. Hitler would not have it. But a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, had become intolerable. Now, may God bless you all, and may he defend the right. For it is evil things that we shall be fighting against. And against them I am certain that the right will prevail.
6 hours after.
And again, we talked about this, the Neville Chamberlain thing, him going through and peace in our time and kind of pushing that that kind of narrative. The British people kind of realized, oh, we have spent too much time placating somebody who cannot be placated. They are going to go into a fight. They're going to absolutely decimate Europe if we allow them to. And so as we're looking at this and we're kind of doing this kind of a look back at what we were seeing through all of the videos that we've had, the Battle of Britain, Divide and Conquer, Prelude to War, Battle of Russia, Battle of China. As we went through those other videos, we saw this stuff, but this is kind of showing the American perspective. The goal of this was to go through and show American service members who just joined, look, this is what was all going on, and this is where we were wrong. What track we're on now of going in and stopping this from these countries from being able to dominate the entire world. This is the path we're on. We started with that heroic kind of intro, talking about heroic figures through the American early years and the building the foundations of America. And now we're starting to get to look, those same founding fathers and those same early principles of America must be defended, even if they're not in the United States, because it could sweep over to the United States.
After Great Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the Republic of France followed. All France is in a maelstrom of activity. The Maginot Line has already opened fire on the Germans. The sparring is ended. World War II has begun.
At home, we were asked, what country is in this war? 82%. We Americans had it. Also, we began to fear that this war was going to concern us. President Roosevelt called a special session of Congress to reconsider the embargo against selling munitions.
I have asked the Congress to reassemble in extraordinary in order that it may consider and act on changes in our neutrality law.
The men of Congress wrestled with their beliefs and our futures. They debated and they argued.
The arms embargo is far too great a security to American peace to permit its surrender without a last-ditch fight.
The Embargo Act, as it now stands, is one-sided and works entirely to the advantage of one side. Therefore, the Embargo Act should be modified.
We, the people, also debated and argued whether we should sell arms and munitions. When the question was put to us, we had an answer. Should we change the Neutrality Act so we can sell war supplies? Yes, 57%. Shortly after, our representatives changed the Neutrality Act. We lifted the embargo on arms and munitions. Now we would sell if purchasers would pay and take the stuff away in their own ships. American ships were still barred from combat zones. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Japan was busy trying to bomb, shoot, and terrorize the Chinese into submission. We began to realize that if Japan conquered 400 million Chinese, strong as to run us right out of the Pacific. In June 1939, with the same question, 74% said we were with China. Mines were made up. When we loaded our scrap iron on Japanese ships, our citizens protested. Let Mr. Atchison, Assistant Secretary of State, tell us the inside of the story.
So until the middle of 1980, the restriction of exports to Japan took the form of moral embargoes of aeroplanes and direct munitions. Then Congress passed the Export Control Act, and increasing cutoffs of scrap iron, aviation gasoline, and other strategic items followed. Exports were curtailed to the limit which those responsible for our defense were willing to risk. It was a fearful responsibility. On one side was the possibility, in fact the probability, that one day these materials might be used against us. On the other side was the possibility, in fact the probability, that to cut them off would provoke an attack which we were not then prepared to resist. Finally, in the summer of 1941, as it became clear that Japan was turning her back upon every possibility of reconciliation and adjustment, and was determined upon her great gamble of conquest, all exports ceased.
On April 9, 1940, the leaders of Nazi Germany shifted their war machine into high gear. They overran into Denmark. They smashed into Norway. On May the 10th, 1940, they blitzed into Holland and Belgium.
The Nazis are marching ahead at the fastest speed a conquering army has moved in all history. All roads in France are choked with slow-moving masses of refugees. Nazi Stuka dive bombers are strafing and bombing thousands of helpless women and children.
Mr. Keltonborn.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, it seems clearly apparent that the first great phase of the war in the West has been won by Germany. The army of French and British has made a valiant battle in its effort to retreat to Dunkirk, where there is some slight chance that some part of it can be evacuated.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward French resistance collapses.
On this 10th day of June 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
This is William L. Shirer speaking from the forest of Compiègne, where Adolf Hitler today is handing his armistice terms to France. It is 3:15 p.m. Adolf Hitler strides slowly toward the little clearing. I can see his face, his grave, solemn, yet hard statue of Marshal Foch. Hitler The French walk on the avenue, led by General Hunsinger. Hitler and the other German leaders rise as the French enter. General Keitel moved to the German armistice term. This whole ceremony is over in a quarter of an hour.
The last time I saw Paris, her heart was warm and gay. I heard the laughter of her heart in every street cafe. The last time I saw Paris, a trees were dressed for spring, and lovers walked beneath the trees, and birds.
So let's jump into another thing that we've not talked about a whole lot. So that change in shape and time of what's going on in the American perception and the American public perception. One of the biggest things that we're seeing change their minds and change how Americans are thinking about this wasn't a terribly new invention at the time, but new since World War I. And that was that radios were pretty much in every home. In 1920, 1930, the radio became kind of a standard in every home. So that was after World War I. So what you're hearing is now people are actually hearing the correspondents talk about what's going on in these faraway countries. A lot of families would have a radio, a stand-up radio especially, that would have a shortwave where they could hear broadcasts from Europe. And so when you're going through and thinking about this, why is the shift happening so quickly? Why are people, the ability to get in not just the written word, but getting in the spoken word. And that's something that is also that really kind of changes how people view things and see things, is because of suddenly you're being able to hear the emotion being conveyed, not just the words. It can kind of change how you feel. And so the American people are listening to what's happening. They're hearing about the horrors happening with Dunkirk and hearing about the horrors in China. And they're hearing about this stuff coming through, and they're starting to change their opinion. Hey, maybe we aren't so isolated. And that's another thing that comes in. And again, we'll tie it in with the stream. When you can hear another voice, even if that voice can't hear you back, it makes you feel more connected. And that's something that has been true through all of human history. And so the written word, there is a little bit of distance there. When you're reading facts, when you're reading the information yourself and processing it, there's a distant connect between you and that other person. But when you can actually hear the voice and hear the tone and tenor and what's going on, it can convey so much more. And so that's where the radio came in to change people's perception. And today we have YouTube, we have Twitch, we have all these other things where not only the written word, but the visual images and everything else can come along with it. And so when we're seeing those changes in people's perceptions of how they're perceiving the war and perceiving these conflicts, China was extremely distant. But as you're hearing about it and you're hearing people talk about it, it becomes much closer. And so those concerns become much closer. And that's a little bit of the change in the tenor of people and the change of the temperament of should we get involved and should we act.
I dodged the same old taxi cab that I had dodged for years. The chorus of their squeaky horns was music to me. The last time I saw Paris, her heart was warm and gay. No matter how they change, I remember
The conquering army now stood on the shores of the Atlantic. The danger was suddenly close. Countries conquered by the Nazis had possessions outside of Europe. These possessions are in America. Would the Nazis demand the French naval units at Martinique? Would the Nazis move into the Dutch oil fields at Curacao? Would the Nazis seize the French naval base at Dakar for invasion of South America? Already in Brazil, there were over 1 million Germans who lived exactly as they did in Germany. 1,200 German schools with Nazi textbooks and Nazi teachers. Nazi newspapers. Hermann Goering glider clubs had been established. Also in Brazil, there were 260,000 Japanese taking orders from Japan. In Ecuador, within easy bombing range of the Panama Canal, German airlines had been established. German pilots were reserve officers of the Luftwaffe. The German transport planes had bomb racks already built in. In Argentina, German athletic clubs similar to the Hitler Youth Movement had been organized exclusively for Germans. Here was a fifth column ready to take over. In Havana, we met with 20 other American republics.
There must not be a shadow of a doubt anywhere as to the determination of the American nations not to permit the invasion of their hemisphere by the armed forces of any power or any possible combination of powers.
20 American nations stood firm. The Americas would not allow any European colony in this hemisphere to be transferred to a non-American power. We said, keep out. We meant it.
We must increase production facilities for everything needed for the Army and Navy for national defense. I believe that this nation should plan at this time a program that will provide us with 50,000 military and naval planes.
To protect our shores, we authorized construction of a two-ocean navy, the greatest the world has ever known. At least it would be the greatest navy when completed in 1944. But then, in 1940, it was only a paper navy. Our fighting forces at that time consisted of an army of 187,000 men, a navy of 120,000, and this dot was the Air Corps, 22,387 strong. All told, 330,000 men. We had makeshift supplies, makeshift equipment, stovepipes for cannon, bags of flour for bombs, and trucks were labeled tanks. Our infantry had exactly 488 machine guns. We possessed 235.
Okay, time for the veterans in the group. I gotta. If you were told, I'm gonna hand you a bag of flour, pretend it's a bomb, and I need you to make the sounds with your mouth while we're using these metal pipes as machine guns. How many of you are actually going to be out there doing that to that full effect? This also is something we've talked about. We've talked about through other watch-alongs. We've talked about through this watch-along. This is how America was able to absolutely come in and dominate. They passed the two Navy two ocean Navy. They passed building up aircraft and machines. This is, we're not going to war, but when war comes, we're ready to answer. This is where you'll get some people talk about the military industrial complex, things like that. It didn't really start here. It was created after this. But this is where America came up with the idea of, if we are ready, if we have a fighting force that's big enough, if we have better equipment, better guns, better supplies, more training, no one is going to want to attack us. And it will be impossible to beat us at home. This is where America learned that lesson. So if you go through and you hear people talk about, well, we spend too much on the military, we need to cut our military spending by a lot. And a lot of countries have. This lesson they learned from World War II through Europe and through other places, you're seeing them learn that lesson again. If we don't have a military, then we are subject to those that do. This is a lesson that was taught very hard. Good Lord, 80 years ago? And it's already being forgotten. if you don't have a fighting force, if you don't have a military that can fight back and fight your battles, then you can easily be overrun.
Pieces of field artillery, 10 light and 18 medium tanks. That was the Army of the United States in May 1940, the month in which the Nazis overran France. So we called our Minutemen, the National Guards of the 48 states, and placed them into federal service. And most important, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. For the first time in our history, we began mobilizing an army while still at peace.
The first number is serial number 158.
This is the Army, Mr. Jones. No private rooms or telephone. You had your breakfast in there before, but you won't have it there anymore.
The second number, which has just been drawn, is 192.
This is the Army, Mr. Green. We like the barracks nice and clean. You had a housemaid to clean your floor, but she won't help you out anymore. Throughout the Bugler's command, they're in the Army and out in a band. This is the Army, Mr. Brown. You and your baby went to town. She had you worried, but this is war, and she won't worry you anymore. She won't worry you anymore.
It wasn't too soon. Time was running out. The Nazis had begun their shattering blitz on Britain.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began. Anti-aircraft guns were in action along the southeast coast today.
Back on Main Street, USA, daily we followed Britain's life struggle. For if Britain died, we would be in grave peril. Our first line of defense in the Atlantic, the British fleet, might go to Nazi Germany. We would be unprotected, our shores, our people, our homes endangered. Britain must not fall. In our harbors, idle and rotting, lay ancient destroyers. They had been built for World War I, but this was World War II, and this gave us an idea. 50 tired, over-aged destroyers were revitalized, transferred to Great Britain. In return, we acquired further protection of our shores. We received a chain of bases stretching from Newfoundland to British Guiana. These bases threw a steel wall around the Caribbean. These bases gave new safety to the Panama Canal. It was now clear to the aggressors that we were conscious of the threat they represented to our country. Mr. Burley, Assistant Secretary of State, will tell us how they got together and tried to scare us off.
From 1936 on, it became increasingly clear to the world that Germany, Italy, and Japan were pursuing a common pattern of aggression, both in Europe and in the Far East. On September 27, 1940, these three powers signed the so-called Pact of Berlin, or Tripartite Pact, a treaty of far-reaching alliance. By that treaty, it was provided that the three countries would assist one another with all political, economic, and military means when one of the powers was attacked. Note particularly the use of the word attacked, by a power not then involved in the European War or in the Chinese-Japan conflict. The last of these provisions was aimed directly at the United States.
Tokyo celebrated. Rome cheered.
a Cesare il figlio d'Augusto.
Berlin hiled itself forth. It was clear now that the three Axis countries definitely stood against us. More anxious than ever, we watched the life and death struggle for the possession of the skies over Britain.
Despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war.
England will not only survive, England will win.
So let's pause there. Wendell Willkie was running for president, and then you had Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh had to get out in front of the people and make statements because he had received so many medals, and actually had received medals from Hitler personally. And so what was really important there was Wendell Willkie wanted to get out and say, we have to make sure that England will survive. He was pushing this narrative that FDR wasn't doing enough to keep our allies alive, or not our allies at the time, but just our other nations alive on the onslaught of the Nazis and of the Japanese. And Charles Lindbergh was out there, hey, look, I am 100% American. I know I've had previous relationships with Germany. However, I am an American through and through. And so this is where we're starting to see those public figures coming out and saying, look, we have to engage. We have to start getting in the fight on this, even if not figuratively or literally in the fight, at least figuratively in the fight, and start getting over supplies to those who are fighting against these totalitarian governments.
So, when we were asked, should we keep out of war or aid Britain even at the risk of war? Aid Britain even at the risk of war, 68%. The march of the self-termed master races changed out in war. To 1941, 15 out of 20 Americans were willing to risk war if war was necessary to ensure Axis defeat.
I've asked this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations. Our most useful and immediate role is to act as an arsenal for them as well as for ourselves. We shall send in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
By an overwhelming majority, Congress passed Lend-Lease, Bill number 1776, another declaration of independence. Independence from tyranny, 1941 style. On April 6, 1941, the Nazi juggernaut overran into Yugoslavia and Greece. On June the 22nd, 1941, the success-crazy Nazis took their longest step toward world conquest. Without any declaration of war, they blitzed into Russia. We were determined not to let down any nations defending themselves against unprovoked attack. So we extended Lend-Lease to these new victims. Now, the Lend-Lease products of our factories were being unloaded in the bombed ports of Great Britain, at the Red Sea ports for the British in Africa. Lend-Lease was being hauled over the Burma Road to China. Lend-Lease was piling up in Murmansk and Iran for Russia. Why did we supply war materials to the countries defending themselves against Axis aggression? Was it our natural sympathies for people unwilling to lose their freedom? Was it our ancient antagonism to conquerors imposing their rule on others by force? Yes, partly. But principally, it was because the American people had become certain that they were on the list of free nations to be conquered.
Two worlds are in conflict, two philosophies of life. One of these two worlds must
break asunder. And we were the leading example of that free world that Hitler was committed to breaking asunder. What would have been our defensive position if the aggressors had succeeded in conquering Britain, Russia, and China?
German conquest of Europe and Africa would bring all their raw materials, plus their entire industrial development, under one control. Of the 2 billion people in the world, the Nazis would rule roughly 1/4, the 500 million people of Europe and Africa, forced into slavery to labor for Germany. German conquest of Russia would add the vast raw materials and the production facilities of another of the world's industrial areas. And of the world's people, another 200 million would be added to the Nazi labor pile. Japanese conquest of the Orient would pour into their factory the almost unlimited resources of that area. And of the peoples of the earth, 1,000 million would come under their rule, slaves for their industrial machines.
We in North and South America would be left with the raw materials of 3/10 of the Earth's surface against the Axis with the resources of 7/10. We would have one industrial region against their 3 industrial regions. We would have 1/8 of the world's population against their 7/8. If we, together with the other nations of North and South America, could mobilize 30 million fully equipped men, the Axis could mobilize 200, thus an Axis and virtually 10.
So let's look at something real quick. They said 2 billion people, 2.2 billion people, I think is what they said, in the world. There is roughly 8.4 billion, 8.6 billion, somewhere in there. And so in this 83 years since this film was created, it would be an average of 74.6 million added to the world's population every year. So that's an incredible number. However, most of it came post World War II was the largest boon. And then, of course, earlier it talked about the several million or the several hundred million in China, where now they're over 1 billion. India's over 1 billion. That number has actually been going down over time. I know overall it's going up. It is actually going down. There's actually now countries that are every generation there's cutting their amount of population down quite considerably. But it's just kind of insane to think in the 83 years since this film was created, we've gone up not just double, but triple the number of what they had at the time in the world.
Times stronger than ourselves. These are the reasons that led us, the American people, to change the Neutrality Act, to send aid to Britain, to Russia, to China, to make ourselves the arsenal of democracy. These are the reasons why now the first American troops set forth into the Atlantic to occupy new bases in Greenland and Iceland with the consent of their local governments. In our hands, bases of defense. In Nazi hands, bases of offense. The Germans opened unrestricted submarine warfare.
If today our Navy should make secure the seas for the delivery of our munitions to Great Britain, it will render as great a service to our country and to the preservation of American freedom as it has ever rendered in all its glorious history.
We want those cargoes protected.
An aroused Congress repealed the entire Neutrality Act. We armed our merchants For the first time, they steamed into combat zones to deliver Lend-Lease. While this was going on in the Atlantic, the Japs, by a so-called agreement with the puppet government of defeated France, moved in on Indochina. There were now only two threats to their plan for conquest of Greater East Asia. First was their northern neighbor, Russia, the only military power within striking distance of Japan. The Nazis were taking care of Russia. The second threat to Japanese conquest was us. Japanese southward expansion was too dangerous to attempt with our bases still standing in the Philippines and our supply lines open to Wake, to Midway, and to Hawaii. We were in their way. We had to be removed. But in the Japanese way. Off to Washington went Special Ambassador Curacao on what the Japs said was a mission of peace. But
so let's make sure you catch this. So they sent an ambassador to the United States on a mission of peace. And if you pay attention to the timeline, this is a really interesting part of history that gets covered up way, way more than it should. It really should stick out of what was actually happening here and what kind of was the back channel of what they were doing and how they were planning on luring the U.S. into a sense of security before things happened.
Fully synchronized with his department of a Jap task force under sealed orders, not on a mission of peace. On November 14th, Mr. Curacao arrived in San Francisco, smiling his toothy smile as he sang the old song of Japanese friendship. The Japanese were a peace-loving people. Their whole policy was devoted to the establishment of permanent peace in Asia. Our aid to China was delaying the establishment of that peace. Our refusal to sell them oil and scrap was interfering with the establishment of that peace. Our objections to their taking over the East Indies, Greater East Asia, was an interruption in the establishment of that peace. All they wanted was peace. On November 17th, Mr. Curacao and Japanese Ambassador Nomura were received by the President in the presence of the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. It very quickly became clear that the Japanese had brought no new proposals and that the Japanese intended to continue their campaign to conquer China and all East Asia. However, on November 26th, our Secretary of State presented the Japanese with the basis for peaceful agreement between the two nations. The proposal was forwarded to Tokyo. The Japs had to stall for time, but only a short time. The task force was nearing its goal. Sunday, December 7th, 1941.
So this part is really important. We all know about Pearl Harbor, but the other timeline that's happening at the same time is what's the really interesting part of what's happening here. So December 7th, 1941, the Japanese have fleets in place to attack Pearl Harbor. But on the other side of the country, the Japanese are doing something completely and totally different.
Eastern Standard Time. The Japanese emissaries are expected at the State Department for 1 o'clock appointment they had requested in order to their answer to our proposals. 1 p.m. The Japanese planes approaching Hawaii. 1:10 p.m. The Japanese emissaries telephoned to postpone their appointment until 1:45. 1:20 p.m. 2 p.m. The Japanese envoys, smiling and correct, arrive at the State Department. 2:20 p.m. Japanese planes had been sowing death and destruction for an hour on American outposts in the Pacific when the Japanese envoys presented a memorandum to Mr. Hull.
Here is the memorandum presented to me. As you can see, it is quite a lengthy document. I read it hurriedly, discovering that it contained a recital of monstrous accusations against the United States, charging it, among other things, with, quote, scheming for the extension of the war, preparing to attack Germany and Italy, two powers striving to establish a new order in Europe, and ignoring Japan's sacrifices in the 4 years of the China affair, menacing the empire's existence itself, and disparaging its honor and prestige. After reading the note, I said to the Japanese emissaries, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them.
I ask that the Congress declare the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United and the Japanese Empire.
So that is why we fight World War II. Um, so a couple things here at the very end of it. One, the attack by Japan, and they knew that they were attacking. They sent the emissaries just kind of to delay from the U.S. from really doing much of else, and then delivering kind of the insulting memorandum after the fact. Kind of was just the extra slap on the face. And if you've, I don't know if the same is true for all services, but if you were a sailor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, if you're watching your ship take damage and you're helpless to do anything about it, there may be times you hate your ship, but every sailor has that tinge of pride in them on their ship. There's never a worse feeling. And so for a lot of those guys, seeing their ships get hit and sunk while they were on shore and unable to do anything to stop it was almost as bad as watching um, a friend or a loved one be injured or killed, um, and being able to do nothing. Because again, you're trained to fight your ship, you're trained to have your ship's pride. A lot of these people lived on the ship, you ate on the ship, everything you knew was on the ship. And so watching it get hit in such a way where it should have been safe. It was in port. It was getting whatever getting done, get whatever it needed getting done to it. And watching it get hit is just for a lot of sailors, it would be almost a soul crushing blow. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, I've talked to a few Pearl Harbor survivors who have talked about that. That was my ship, and I watched the bombs come and hit, and I watched the torpedoes, and just the feeling of it. It wasn't a hunk of metal floating in the water getting hit. It was a friend. It was a brother. It was something so much more. And then again, these series of films, these 7 films were shown to service members as they had first gotten into service. And I know for me, watching these, it kind of there's some patriotism to them. There's some anger that you get over certain things that are happening. Um, the education portion of it, and again, there's propaganda mixed in, but there's a lot of education on what's going on or what was happening in there. And so, for a lot of them, this may be the first time that they've seen a movie or seen anything like this before. It's a first of its kind with some of the stuff it was doing. Um, being shown these and being told this is why you're fighting, I think it's clearer from this than what some soldiers know and what some sailors know about the fighting going on even today. Because this gives you such an in-depth look of this is why we're in this fight, and a lot of times that picture's taken away from the lower-ranking soldier, lower-ranking sailor, where they don't really know the full story of why we're in a fight. So I think this is kind of, even with the propaganda elements, I think it is an absolutely wonderful thing they did, and I think it should be continued on to today. If we're going to go into a war, having things like this that can educate you on why we're in the fight, why the history of the fight, that kind of thing, would go a long way to kind of show why we're going into the conflicts we're going into. Um, we appreciate you guys being here with us through this series. We're going to start some new stuff up on Tuesday. And covering it. We're going to continue along with our watch alongs and our history content. But we'll be back again tomorrow, Friday, I think 11:30 a.m. With Recon Sarge on Fallout 4. There's a poll up, so on our YouTube, if you'll go check out the YouTube, there's a poll on what you would like to see us do next on the gaming series. So check that out. Please respond to the poll if you get a chance to. And then also, with everything going on, I hope you enjoy our slight changeover we're doing, switching everything over to the Mission 4938 names. It makes it easier to find. We're going to be doing some other updates and some other changes to our stream in the upcoming few days. So be on the lookout for that. We're just so excited for everything that's going on, and we appreciate everything that you guys are doing to help make this community the great place it is. Check out our Discord, check out our Facebook page. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to talk to us directly, it's real easy. Jump in the Discord. We're in there. If we're not in there, you can always reach out to us on there as well. But join the conversation, be part of the community, because again, it's not just about veterans, it's about veterans, their families, all those that support. And we're here for you guys. And until next time, as always, stay strong, stay true, stay Frankie.